Hi, everyone. This is Leela Harris here again with Kendi DeLay-Gill, and this is another episode of our relationship series. Today, we are going to talk about money. And I'm really excited to hear what you're going to say, Kendi, because my experience with money, it hasn't been a huge topic that I've worked with in my own personal work, in the inner work.
Oh, really?
I know that I have, of course, feelings about money, and so I've worked with it just a little bit, but yeah, I know it's a huge topic for most of us.
Yeah, I've worked with it a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. And I've been surprised by the aspects around money, how much hypnotically we pick up without realizing that we do. I mean, the first thing is that there is, like, all of our survival on this planet is based on our ability to generate money. That's why it's such a huge topic, because if money isn't there, we can't eat, we don't have a roof over our head, we don't get the nice things, we don't get the basic things, we can't have, right? And I know that I underestimated how much security or comfort comes from knowing that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And how much strain is there when you've got to rely on your own creativity, and you've got to rely on your own capacity to generate, and you've got to rely on your own ability to climb the ladder or whatever it might be to progress, like how much responsibility a person carries for their growth around money too.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's been a very, very fascinating topic, because I thought, for example, that if you save money, that you're being sensible because you're saving for a rainy day and you're protecting yourself against the unknown, and you're trying to basically be responsible about taking care of yourself.
Mm-hmm. And like retirement and things like that.
That's right. And so I grew up when I was putting part of my income into my pension and part of my income into retirement funds into funds for the children's education, and part of it into this and that and the other. Like, I was very sensible about how that money should be allocated, and not all of it went into spending. But it took a session with the Dalian Method to discover that when you're really insecure about life and you don't trust that things are going to unfold well for you, that's when your attention goes into hoarding the money and sort of having these pots and holding it all together. It's actually a byproduct of being scared that you won't have enough. And that is not the same as, I'm being responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it's such a fundamental part of the teachings that we grow up with, to make sure that we've got a reserve for this and that and the other. And I'm not saying it's a wrong thing. I'm so glad that I have actually done all of those things. But to understand the subtlety underneath it, that is fear-based, that is driven by an inability to trust life. So that bit, I think, really shocked me at the beginning when I was first doing my inner work and trying to understand my relationship with money.
Yeah, and I know for me, it's definitely felt like I feel the sense of cushion that money gives me.
Yeah.
It just gives me almost like a sense of security, even if I don't need it for something. And I was looking back, because I knew we were going to talk about money, and I was looking back over my life about how I've experienced money. And when I've had extra money, like in the bank, and I didn't need to spend it on anything, I didn't, I just had it as extra money. It was like I didn't really need to spend it on anything, or I didn't need to buy anything. But then if I don't have the extra money, and it's like I'm just barely paying my bills, whenever I've had those experiences, all of a sudden my mind wants all these things. It's like, I want new clothes, I want this. And that's happened to me, every time I haven't had very much money.
Right.
Almost every time. It's just noticing how my mind is when it's like, when it's thinking I don't have very much, then it's like I need money and I want this and I want this. It's like I need. And also what you said about I think you called it tension, but yeah, when I'm unclear about what's going to happen money-wise, or I think I'm not going to be able to pay my bills, yes, it's amazing how the anxiety, then there's like this almost like a cloud hanging over my head about it. And that feeling of trust and surrender or things like that, which I've experienced, become really, it can be really hard. Like it's really putting it to the test. Like how much can you trust? Yeah. And I found it very challenging.
And it's connected with death ultimately. Because that sense of survival or whether I'm going to make it is ultimately the fear of death. And so it's so intertwined with the accumulation of money. And like in my home, there's been so many complexities because when you are earning more money than your partner, then there's power battles that arise that I had no idea would or should, but they did. Because sometimes the more money somebody earns, the other person can become extremely insecure that they're not doing as well. So that begins to affect your self-esteem. And it's almost like your self-esteem is being measured by the value of money. And it has nothing to do with your self-esteem. And society, like the way that our sort of successful model in society is structured, so many people are being revered because they have a lot of money, like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or whatever. Like so much advice is being handed out because they have a lot of money. But really, there's real subtlety behind it is that they are the most insecure people because that's why they're having to hoard so much money. And we miss that part. We look at it with reverence to say that's a measure of success, but it's actually a measure of total insecurity. And we don't know that.
Happening inside the person is what you were talking about, is hoarding out of fear.
Fear.
And then trying to grow that feeling of like all powerful.
That's right.
I think it is related to, our mortality. If I have enough money, I live forever. It just gives you that, maybe that feeling.
Yeah. And also, I've also seen that there's another link as well. And that is that if there's like an absence of love in your life, so your ego has to have a target to concentrate on. So if there's an absence of love, then that same energy goes into having to accumulate money. Because if you don't have people, then that attention goes to money instead. And so then that money thing becomes more of a focus.
And I think another thing about lack of love, because so much of what we call love in our society, or what we grew up learning about what we think love is often not really the love that as we've been doing our inner work. Kendi, I know we've had conversations about what real love is and real compassion. And I know I find that I have to prove love less to people by doing certain things, by like, here, I love you, here, I bought you something, and vice versa. I don't necessarily expect the other person to be like, here, and then it's like, oh, they love me, they spent this much money, or they did this. But I used to do those things more because I think I wasn't really present with the people in my life, and I wasn't loving them, and my heart wasn't really open. So there was almost this like sense deep down that I'm lacking that connection and that giving. So it felt like I had to give in a different way.
That compensate for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I did that to some extent, I think, when I was first raising my children, because the more I was absent from them and the more I was in the workplace generating money, the only way I compensated for the guilt for the fact that I wasn't present was by showering them with more gifts. And if you really look at children, they don't want more gifts. They just want your love. but you don't even know that you're doing it because it happens unconsciously. You're compensating for something, and you
The person
don't.
is so happy, so you don't.
Yeah.
Often, maybe not always, but they're often happy at least to have that. At least
That's
I got this great new present.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it has nothing to do with real connection with that person, but you're compensating for the fact that you're absent out of their life. So money is a complicated thing because it also drives a lot of the manipulation in families too, because people will talk to you a certain way or do certain things because they need something to be funded, or they expect something to come their way. And so that drives a lot of the way people communicate with one another. It's such a fundamental piece of how relationships unfold.
Yeah.
Because when you have different values around money, my God, the amount of arguments. Yeah, the amount of arguments. We've faced so many complex conflicts in this home just based on having different values around money.
You and your husband?
Yeah. Because I'm happy to spend it, and I'm happy to share it, and I'm happy to I'm happy to do those things because there's been the success and there's been the money. And so his attitude is not so free with it because it's more of a strain for him and more of a it's like when you have, like you just said, if you have, you don't want, right? So your bank account has money in it, you don't want to go off and buy more things. But when you don't have, then you're very aware that I don't have, and therefore I'd like this, or I'd like that, or I'd like that, right? So it's the same concept with this. Is like when you've had a successful career, you have, and then you either know whether it was fulfilling or you know that it wasn't. And in my case, I definitely saw that money does not buy you happiness. I definitely saw that the American dream of chasing money is a red herring. And I definitely saw that it leaves you empty-handed. So then the emphasis on money per se just became much less in my eyes, because I knew it's not the utopian answer to what we really need as human beings. But if you haven't yet attained that desire to attain is still going to be waiting to be lived until you get to the stage of seeing, now that it's been lived, actually it wasn't enough. So I think it's very different for you where you're at in your life. I can freely spend it because I don't have as much value and weight around it as others might do.
I wanted to speak to something, what you were talking about earlier, just to offer a different perspective as far as money goes, like accumulating money and how often those people are deeply unhappy. Of course, not always. It depends on the person. If they've been in integrity and they're not attached to it, but they could have a lot of wealth just because that's where they are. For me, I've noticed that I've always been uncomfortable with having too much money.
Oh, really?
Not that I've had a lot of it, but when I've had extra money, I think I had a sense of guilt about it. So I think we're coming from very different perspectives on it. For me, I think I felt uncomfortable when I had money, like I shouldn't have it or I don't deserve it. So even though I didn't necessarily feel like I needed to spend it, I think I gave a lot of it away at times because I had it. And also I had an astrologer tell me one time, if money comes your way, stop, don't give it away. Just like have it, just experience having the money. So I think I'm supposed to experience having money and enjoying money. Just my sense that this is a big lesson for me personally is to enjoy money, but to enjoy making it as well, doing what I love. And so I think I struggle a little bit with that, with money coming in and maybe feeling that, oh, I don't need that money or it's too much. So just noticing what kind of my relationship with money is.
But it is the currency. It is the measure of exchange of energy on this planet. So for what you give something, whatever that is, if it's an engineering service or if it's or if it's an admin service, or if it's anything, whatever you give gets rewarded through the exchange of money.
Mm-hmm.
So on this planet, like, everything's constructed around it being sort of a value placed on you. But yet I remember it was actually the same, maybe it was the same astrologer. Jesse said to me, he said, the birds don't need to be paid to feel good about themselves, because they just feel good about themselves. But as human beings, when you get paid the appropriate fee for what you're bringing, of course, it does have value to it, because it's an appropriate exchange for what you've just brought in, right? So it's actually complicated. I think money is a very, very tough topic.
Yeah, I think
it doesn't determine the value of you, but it is still an exchange of the contribution you're making to society.
Yeah, because I think for me, I could easily just go off and go, oh, money doesn't matter. Like, I wish there's part of me that would feel really comfortable in a world where money doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. I don't have to think about it. But actually, it's a cop-out for me to not think about money. I don't want to have to sit there and budget or worry about, but I think it's grounding for me to do that. So yeah, it depends on every person. Where is our pain point with money?
That's right.
Having it, not having it, making it, giving it away or not giving it away, yes. Hoarding it, not being able to save it, spending it when you have it, and not being able to just have a little bit extra. Yeah.
Yeah, and your pendulum does swing back and forth as well. Because like if you watch what happens in society, there's so much emphasis on becoming a 7-figure something or other, or like there's so much, like, you know, how to get your $10,000 client or whatever, and as if it's the thing we're all chasing, and as if it's the ultimate value of what you are as a human being. But really that chase only defines how insecure you are. But if you sat on your laurels and thought, well, I don't have to concern myself about having to put my energy out into action, and I don't actually have to put any effort in, then what's happening is your creativity is completely stagnant. You're not actually getting to use the resources that are inside you to help contribute into society. And so your ambition, like, you're almost ambitionless, and that's not a healthy place to be either. So it's almost like you have to have the ambition to want to contribute, but be unattached to money is the ultimate utopian place. Like, I contribute for the joy of the fact that I'm participating my energy, and I love to share what I'm sharing in whatever way it is. But at the same time, and I expect to be rewarded appropriately for it because it has value to it. But now that the money's come in, I'm not attached to it because it doesn't define me. It doesn't define anything about my integrity or who I am. It just happens to be the fair exchange that came in for my contribution. Because if you take spiritual people, so many people will say, well, if that's a spiritual teacher, she shouldn't be charging. That's a gift for us, for humanity. But yet a doctor could charge 6 times the amount of money and not really do as much good, right? And so that's, again, these ideas that we have in society that spiritual people should be poor, or they shouldn't be rewarded, or they shouldn't be rewarded. They shouldn't be rewarded for their gifts, right?
Or you shouldn't have like an abundance. You should be at a minimal, like, you know, get by, but don't have. Right. Yeah, and there is a lot of judgment about that when it's connected to spirituality, because then.
That's right.
Yeah, it's.
And apparently it's not real spirituality if somebody's having to pay for those spiritual services.
You know, a plumber, you wouldn't ask a plumber, hey, aren't you a good person? Don't you feel like fixing my toilet for free?
That's right, yeah. So we have so many ideas that are all topsy-turvy. But for me, I'm getting that understanding. It's like to have the ambition to want to contribute, to have the ambition to actually see what creativity is inside you and what is it that it wants to uniquely share. So therefore to expect and value money for that, but at the same time not to be defined by it.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, because it's about where the ambition is.
Yeah.
Not necessarily having no ambition.
Yeah. So like when we're doing our work now, like, are we doing it because we are doing it because it brings us joy? Or are we doing it because we want to earn money through it? So is it driven through greed, or is it driven through an aspiration to flower? Or is it driven through wanting to be special? Like there's so many complex things, because sometimes we're wanting to accumulate wealth so that we can be seen to be special. Again, the same thing. It's insecurity that's driving you to want that in the first place.
Yeah, and if we don't look at these, or we're afraid to look at them, and we live our whole lives being mechanically driven by that, I've just seen just how unfulfilling that is. I've just looked into it, and how sad that would be, that we've spent, our whole lives kind of in our mechanical unconscious behavior. And then, like in your case, maybe connecting your self-worth to money and doing it only for money. For me, not ever doing anything, because I'm not like, oh, what's the point?
Yeah.
And then not sharing what I'm here to share and not take that risk. Yeah. And so even though these things are very challenging, dealing with money is a challenging kind of sore spot for a lot of us. It is really helpful to look at it now instead of waiting till later in life, I think, so that we're not just driven mechanically by fear. And
yeah, and also the thing is, like, a lot of, like, for example, Vancouver now has become extremely expensive.
mm-hmm.
For housing, for all sorts of aspects of your cost. Like, my tax bill came in yesterday, and it's 70% higher than last year, because of some new like political tax or something that's being imposed on large properties. And so it's a really important topic, because so much of your survival is based on whether you can pay or you can't pay, and whether you've got a roof over your head or whether you've not got a roof over your head, whether you own the property or whether you're renting it. But for our new generation now in Vancouver, it's become almost impossible for them to buy a roof over their head. So I look at it now from a perspective of, it's not as easy to say it's not a very important topic, because the way things are being structured around in this area, it would be irresponsible for our children not to think about how they're going to earn money, because otherwise they're not even going to be able to afford a space with a roof over their head.
Yeah, and they can think about it or work with that without being driven by fear or worry, right? It's more with the creativity and the intelligence and connecting to what they're here to do and their intelligence. So, yeah.
And that requires a lot of education, because our schooling system is designed for us to become, the right phrase is, it's almost like cogs in the wheel. It's like cogs in the system. Like we're programmed to become machines in a system. And so many people will get to retirement age and discover that they've barely got anything to live on, and yet their entire livelihood, their entire life has been spent working 60, 70 hours a week. And that's not fair either, because the education around money, the appropriate education around money, wasn't given to the people early on.
Mm-hmm.
So we do become slaves to a system too. And paycheck to paycheck is a very hard way to live.
Or waiting till retirement to enjoy our lives.
Yeah. Or even that concept of retirement. Like, for example, so much of my money went into my pension. And I had a meeting with the pension advisor last month, and I got told that October was, one of the worst years in the last 10 years. And I've lost so much of my pension value just in that 1 month. But when you're getting older and closer to your retirement age, that security isn't even in the pension because of the volatility in the markets. And so nothing is a straight line when it comes to addressing money. It's like a juggling act all the time.
Well, what would you say, because we'll just wrap up the last few minutes here, but I do have a question. What would you say is the best way for people to, do you think that addressing the emotions and the fears are really important when handling money? Because there's the practical mind that says this is a smart way. You talked about that at the beginning. This is a smart way. You do this, this, and this. But how would you articulate the value of working through the emotions and the fears and the beliefs, especially handed down from our parents and other generations in society?
Honestly, I didn't know that the beliefs and the fears were there. When I really look back on my own life now, I was somehow on like I wanted to be more than what I had seen around me. I saw education as the route to be more than what I had seen around me. The education necessarily gave me the impression that meant that I would be somewhere further up in the ladder somewhere. And that's how it went. But now all our children are getting educated. Now, more or less, most people are going to university, and they're coming out with these huge debts because our education was free at the time when we were growing up. Now it's costing thousands and thousands of dollars. So where we might have taken on a mortgage as our first debt, so to speak, to have to manage, our children are having to deal with debts straight out of school because their education is costing so much money, and they may not necessarily even get a job. So perhaps the way that all of that is being structured, where the strain on our kids is arriving earlier, is for this primary purpose, for our relationship with money to be understood, that we get to a point where we're not scared for our survival because we've learned how to trust life, and we are more focused on what is it that is my potential that I'm willing to contribute, and what is it that my strengths are, and what is it that my gifts are, and what is it that brings my joy. If some of that education can start coming in early, then the relationship around money would be less fear-driven, right? So perhaps the pressure is happening now so that our young generations can start looking at this topic sooner, because I got to 50 odd years and didn't even know that I had these fears around money.
Yeah, and that connection to what we're here to offer, or who we, more being closer to our true self and living from that, and how that's actually connected to abundance.
Totally, because there's an abundant supply of creativity inside you.
Yeah.
But society is created, honestly, Leela, against you. So that's why the topic of money is very complicated, because all the organizational structures, all the institutions, the family structures that are behind all the big banking systems, behind the big wealth systems, behind the stock market, it is designed to only really feed the rich. It's not designed for abundance to be shared. And that's why I think the education around the topic of money is not a straightforward one. It's not a simple do this and then you've got this sorted. There's a lot more that needs to be dismantled in the outside structure that can only be dismantled when people become more conscious.
Yeah, beautifully said. Only when people become more conscious. I think that's the bottom of the whole thing, is that consciousness. Thank you, Kendi.
My pleasure. It was fun.
Thanks, everyone.